In order for this transition to fossil-free world to take place, we need the money to lead the way, right? So in this section, we will dig deeper into how finance can lead the green transition.
For too long, the finance industry and society at large ignored the consequences of CO2 emissions. In recent years, this has changed. Leaders in finance are speaking out about the need for sustainable investing and massive capital allocation to climate solutions. Is it all talk? Or can finance lead the green transition?
We're delighted to, as our first speaker in this section, introduce a person who is not afraid of rocking the boat. Tariq Fancy, who is with us from Toronto.
This is Tariq Fancy, founder and CEO at the Rumi Initiative and the former Chief Investment Officer for Sustainable Investing at BlackRock. Rumi is a non-profit Google-backed technology startup used in over 140 countries, whose award-winning technology uses microlearning to make building new skills fun and engaging, including in remote and offline communities.
Great to have you on the show, Tariq Fancy. Please fire away.
Thank you. My name is Tariq Fancy. I spent many years working on Wall Street before deciding in 2013 to quit and found Rumi, a nonprofit that makes free microlearning courses available to all. In 2018, BlackRock, the largest investment firm in history, hired me to return to the industry and see if I could take my investment experience and my new social impact experience from Rumi and merge the two as their first ever Chief Investment Officer for Sustainable Investing. This decade will make or break us on climate. And at BlackRock, which manages nearly $9 trillion, I was at the center of an alluring win-win proposition that was meant to help. Unfortunately, having worked on what The Guardian recently called the biggest, most ambitious effort ever to turn Wall Street green, I can now tell you three things with confidence. First, it doesn't work. The vast majority of green products on the market today create new profits for investment firms, but do absolutely nothing to fight climate change. Second, these products, the marketing, and the bogus narratives around them are creating a giant societal placebo that's hurting us by actively delaying overdue government action to combat the climate crisis. And third, the entire premise of this session is actually flawed. Of course, finance must participate in fighting the climate crisis. But on the whole, it's not structured to lead, it's structured to follow. The financial services industry plays a critical role in the economy. It sits between our savings, for example, your bank deposits or a retirement plan managed on your behalf, and the productive uses of that capital in our economy, such as companies that take and use the capital to run their operations. This flow of capital in the economy acts a bit like blood that's pumped through your veins and throughout the different parts of your body. Because the professional investment managers that sit at the center of that process make decisions on how to allocate other people's money, like our savings, they're subject to pretty strict legal constraints. And one of those is that they have to focus on maximizing value. And I mean dollar value, which is clear and easy to measure, not social values. Unfortunately, the central problem of climate change is that the market doesn't properly value our natural environment. People can burn fossil fuels cheaply and not pay the social costs of that pollution. Science tells us clearly that the costs will be very high, but those costs will be paid someday in the future by the youngest and the poorest in society, and disproportionately people of color. So it's easy for leaders to ignore it. The market will chase almost anything if it's legal and makes money. If running a drug cartel suddenly became legal, Goldman Sachs bankers would be in Mexico 9 seconds after the announcement to pitch the Sinaloa cartel to run their IPO. And once the IPO was done and they took their 7% fee, they'd turn to the cartel heads and ask them, now that you're rich and it's all clean, have you met our wealth management division? And funnily enough, that's actually not Goldman Sachs' fault. That's just the game. And it's exactly the game I was part of when I first learned to invest many years ago in what's called the vulture investing space, where the most sharp-elbowed hedge funds operate. That's why I've always found it so bizarre when people talk about divestment, the idea of selling fossil fuel shares as a way to fight climate change. It's well intended, but who cares if you sell the shares? I can tell you 25 hedge funds off the top of my head who'll buy them. Nothing changes. Think of it this way. Do you know anyone who owns short shares in porn companies? The public markets have fully divested them, which makes no difference, as you'll know if you have an internet connection, since they're now just privately held by shareholders we can't see. As long as it's legal and it makes profits, it'll probably get financed. That's how capitalism works. Now we're seeing a new crop of sustainable funds that claim to help in the fight against climate change. These premium priced products would generally just tilt away from polluting companies in a form of soft divestment, are based on the same flawed theory of change, that by refusing to partake in injustice, you somehow stop it, and will similarly have zero impact. Even the discussion of climate risks in the financial system is misleading. Protecting investment portfolios from climate change is not the same thing as protecting the planet from climate change. I remember telling a friend who lives in Miami about it. They're heavily exposed to extreme weather conditions, and he was excited that it could help. I didn't have the heart to tell him that the goal on climate risks wasn't to stop climate change from wrecking Miami. It was to get our money out before it hits. The thesis and the products we're being sold are all based on a dangerous idea that the change we need can be achieved through individual one-by-one action. Not just divestment. This includes campaigns to pressure individual banks to stop lending to fossil fuel companies. Meanwhile, something called the shadow banking sector, which is estimated at over $100 trillion, is waiting to take their place. Trying to stem the market's flow of money to harmful activities this way, one by one, is like playing the game whack-a-mole against millions and millions of moles. Imagine if we fought COVID-19 with an approach like this, going door to door, asking people individually to please wear a mask and avoid going to the crowded bar down the street. It would never work. So governments around the world stepped in, using their special powers to flatten the curve by restricting travel, closing high-risk venues, and making masks mandatory indoors. And then, just as that held down the infections curve, they provided the leadership the pharma industry needed to expedite new vaccines with massive pre-orders and new emergency approval processes. Similarly with climate change, the experts have argued for decades that we need systemic, market-wide solutions enforced by law, such as a price on carbon, vehicle emissions limits, all to bend down the greenhouse gas emissions curve, all while we aggressively drive public and private investments in new technologies, such as renewable power and carbon capture. Changing the incentives at a systemic level changes the behavior of all the participants. And as always, finance will simply follow the new source of profits. It's kind of like us reprogramming that whack-a-mole game, such that now all of the moles start to find it less and less attractive to pop up. And millions of them all slowly begin to recede into their holes all by themselves. Unfortunately, to serve their short-term interests, many leaders still prevent such measures, claiming today that the free market will solve this problem, which is code for maintaining a status quo that benefits them. The problem is not capitalism, it's the rules that we set within the capitalist system. There's no such thing as a free market. All markets have rules. And like the rules that govern a competitive sports game, the rules of competitive markets can be updated to meet the needs of the day. The systemic change that we need can and should only be led by democratically elected leaders who work with policy experts to guide capital and business activity in the direction that we need to go in. Let me close with a message directly for the young people who are finally looking for real action on the climate crisis. Many of you just sacrificed over a year of your lives, disrupting your education to protect against something that's a greater threat to baby boomers. Maybe you should ask if their generation now plans to return the favor on something that the science tells us is a greater threat to you. Beware anyone whose answer is that we need aggressive government action to protect baby boomers, while bankrupt free market theories are good enough for Gen Z. Don't buy that from Wall Street. As with the pandemic, only governments truly have the power to lead in addressing a systemic crisis. Tell your politicians to do their jobs and fix the rules. You can't address a market failure with marketing. We need real change. And whatever you do, don't let them convince you that there's too much else going on now with the pandemic and that fighting climate change can wait. Your best chance for change is while the public appreciation of the risks of not listening to science are the most acute. That time is now. And if you lead, myself and people of all ages will follow you because, well, we don't have time. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Tariq Fancy, for your brave and strong statement. What reactions are you receiving from the financial sector on your view on this topic?
Generally speaking, I'd say not a peep. There's been a few responses by people who have some role in some peripheral part of the machine and whose job it is to promote these products. There's been a debate from the other side, but the largest voices in the space have ducked the fight. They have no incentive to have a debate like this while they're launching high-fee investment products at the exact same time that are gathering massive amounts of assets at above normal fees, and all of which they know well don't actually fight the climate crisis. So the easiest thing for them to do is hope the message goes away. And that's what I'm trying to obviously fight against.
Well, thank you, Tariq Fancy. Nick, questions from you, please.
Yeah, just really a straightforward question, Tariq. So, I mean, we've got the UN Climate Conference coming up in November in Glasgow in Scotland. If, as you characterise what's happening in the investment community is spot on, what do you want those governments to do in Glasgow? What would you ask them to do with this problem as you see it?
I think that the most important thing that can happen in Glasgow is a fundamental rethinking of a set of economic narratives that have dominated Western democracy since the 1980s. That narrative tells you that free markets solve all problems. It led to the financial crisis. It is now leading to a position where we're falling far behind on a systemic crisis like climate change. And there's no excuse to believe that kind of nonsense. For 13 years after the financial crisis, which came because of deregulation, they've fixed very little of the underlying problems in the system. You've seen large family offices and other banks and other situations, or even in the last month, that are potentially endangering the system. And at some point, the politicians have to realize that every competitive sports game needs referees. I mean, can you imagine playing a football match without referees? People would foul each other and so on. At some point, someone's got to give out a red card. And unless the actual governments do their jobs through taxes and regulation to manage what are called externalities, we're going to be in big trouble. Because as of today, some business leaders are still holding on to the fantasy that the free market will solve this problem. And I actually think that that's morally reprehensible as a position to hold decades after we've known that climate change is the greatest market failure in history. It's a position that serves their short-term interests and comes at the expense of the long-term public interest.
Well, thank you so much, Tariq Fancy.
Thank you.